Trade rumors are continuing to escalate for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and a new report has revealed a wild Leafs trade target that Brad Treliving could be looking to acquire this offseason to fill the hole that Tyler Bertuzzi left the Toronto Maple Leafs when he ultimately chose to leave them in free agency. We're going to break down that exact report and discuss what a trade could look like for the Leafs. So stay tuned for all that in this episode. But before we do, if you're a part of the large percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We produce daily Leafs content. We keep you up to date with all the latest news because there's a ton regarding the Toronto Maple Leafs right now. And let's just dive right into it. This is an interesting report revealing a new Leafs target that we haven't discussed yet on the channel. And brace yourselves because it's a player that Brad Treliving signed the contract for just a little bit ago when he was the GM of the Calgary Flames. And here he is. You got a sneak peek of the contract there, so that might scare you all a little bit. But this is Alberta. The Leafs should trade for Blake Coleman. And if you're unfamiliar with Blake Coleman, he is a very, very good player. The issue is, and we'll dive into some of the issues, but the Leafs are linked to this guy. And quite frankly, Darius, I think it would be a pretty good fit for the team. And we're mentioning this in a lot of our videos. The Leafs need to add a forward. They need to add some of their depth because they lost Tyler Bertuzzi. They might lose Nick Robertson, who's requested a trade. And at this point, they need to add some veteran guys or even younger guys. But veterans make a lot of sense at this point, strictly because their window now is over the next couple of years with a lot of the contracts that they've signed. You can see here, according to sources close to the Leafs Nation over the past week, Toronto's been scouring the trade market in search of some forward depth. And there's no question that the departure of Tyler Bertuzzi left a big hole in the top six, and obviously Easton Cowan is up for grabs, and they linked the Leafs to Coleman. Now, the contract, which we'll get into in a minute, we'll go through all this, but Darius, what are your thoughts on Blake Coleman potentially joining the Leafs?
Yeah, well, I hope nobody's too scared yet because we're about to get into the contract details, and that might scare everybody a little bit more. But if some Leaf fans remember, they were linked to Blake Coleman in around 2021, I think, when his contract was up with the Tampa Bay Lightning. So back then, they were linked together, the Leafs and Blake Coleman. And this is a really good player, right? Like you mentioned, Nick. I mean, could be a pretty viable option to replace Tyler Bertuzzi. Like, look at the points here on a really bad team. Like, he has 54 points last season in 78 games on a terrible Calgary Flames team. Like, they were horrible. And he would not have to play the role that he played in Calgary with the Leafs, right? He would play a lesser role. And I think he could really fit in on this Leafs team. He would have been perfect back then. He's perfect now for the Leafs. But if you look at the contract details, a little shocking, right? I don't think it's going to work out for the Leafs. You still got another 2 years left on that deal that Brad Treliving signed, which is hilarious, in Calgary. So I'm just not sure that salary works for the Leafs. You would have to make a couple huge moves to make this work. But I wonder, because Calgary is in a quote unquote rebuild or retool, whatever they want to use at this point, whatever term, I wonder if there is a world where they retain some salary if the Leafs give up something, juicy in the trade as well, where it could work for the Leafs. So I think it's a viable option for the Leafs for sure. They're going to have to get creative. It would not be like a 1-for-1 swap because that salary just doesn't make sense for the Leafs, but he can certainly help them. I'm not saying he's going to be, a definite top six help. We don't even know what Bobby McMahon, a full season of him in the NHL, looks like either, right? But a third line position for him, I think he's another really good option for the Leafs.
Yeah, he is. And you mentioned that contract. It is a 6-year 29.4, so it carries a cap hit of 4.9 with no trade clause, which Brad Treliving seems to love. But you look at this player, and again, the article kind of goes into it. He's 32 years old, has 3 years left on his 6-year, almost $30 million deal, but he would come with a bit of term and a decent cap hit. But indisputably, he's the type of player that would make a lot of sense for Brad Treliving to target. Obviously, he signed this guy, Blake Coleman, a couple years ago. But he's also coming off a career-high 30-goal campaign, and considering he's never sniffed that plateau before, it would probably be in Calgary's best interest to at least contemplate the idea of selling high. And you mentioned it, 30 goals would help a lot with the goal scoring they lost in Tyler Bertuzzi. It would help a lot in goal scoring they potentially lose in Nick Robertson. And it would also fill in really well on that third line or wherever he ends up playing. And Darius, obviously, he's almost 33 years old, has some term left. But as we keep mentioning, when you look at the rest of the contracts that Brad Treliving gave this offseason, Chris Tanev, you're paying that amount of money to him to be elite for the next 2 to 3 years, probably 2 years to be elite defenseman and then decent, trail off at the end, maybe retire, go to the island. But OEL as well, he's on the older side. Both of these players are OEL's 32, but Chris Tanev is pretty old, 34, I think. The problem is, if you get a guy like Blake Coleman, you're also obviously aging yourself out a little bit more, but it makes sense for the next 2 years where Blake Coleman's probably going to be a very good player for 2 years. Then you're putting yourself in a 2-year window. The issue is, what happens after that when you're stuck with this guy at this cap hit? But if they're going for the win, it lines up with the rest of their contracts very well, and quite frankly, makes a bit of sense. Though I feel like at this point, instead of doing this, you probably should have went further or went harder, sorry, for Tyler Bertuzzi.
Yeah, and I mean, when looking at this contract, it kind of matches up with the window. So if there is retained salary in, if there's a world where there is retained salary in the trade, it kind of matches up with the end, quote unquote, of their cup window, right? And this player won't be 40 or 41 years old when the contract is up either. You're probably going to get the last of his good years out of this contract. So I really don't hate it in that way. And like you mentioned too, I mean, I would have liked to keep Tyler Bertuzzi, but this could be a really good option. This guy scored 30 goals last year on a bad team. I'm going to reiterate that, right? Calgary Flames were not very good. And if he comes over to the Leafs, it could help in the top six. Maybe McMahon does shift down, right? And I thought he was great last year. You can rejig the entire lineup from there, right? And this is a guy who can play in the middle six, right? They can find him a spot there, and he would be really, really useful. So I think it's a good fit on paper, 100%, but the cap hit, you're going to have to get creative there. And the one thing we haven't mentioned the whole video, I love this player, right? Stanley Cup champion. He went to the Calgary Flames. He's been good ever since. Right now, he's a Calgary Flame, and Calgary does not want to trade with Toronto. And we've gone through that a couple of times. So love the player on paper. Probably won't happen because of the team he plays for, which is unfortunate, but it would be a good fit.
Yeah. Though, if there was a player that the Flames would want to maybe get rid of at their current point in their rebuild, or whatever you call it, since trading Matthew Tkachuk and all these things, it would make sense for them to want to get rid of Blake Coleman. And if Toronto is willing to do that, and I'll ask you now in a second, what does the package you look like? Again, do you think it's a Nick Robertson-based package? Do you think it would make sense for the Flames, especially if there's some retained salary, maybe a prospect, Abrazizi, some lower-end kind of guy there? And again, he is a prototypical Craig Berube player, which is another thing to keep in mind. As Brad Treliving is trying to build. We've seen it with Tanev. We've seen it with OEL to a degree. Maybe hoping Craig Berube can turn OEL into a Craig Berube player. But I don't know. What do you think the contract or the trade, would look like? Would Nick Robertson and a low-end prospect, perhaps?
I mean, we're naming the same guys over and over again because it's the only guys the Leafs can move off of. So you're looking at like David Kampf, who I don't think the Calgary Flames will have much interest in. I see a guy like Nick Robertson doing fantastic in Calgary. He's the type of player that Calgary needs. It would be a great opportunity for him as a player to put up a lot of points and kind of have some freedom because they're probably not going to make the playoffs and they're in a rebuild. So I could see Nick Robertson going, but you're going to have to free up some more salary, right? But I think Nick Robertson for Blake Coleman, right? Selling high, like you said, on the Calgary Flames, they're probably going to want a little bit more, even though Nick Robertson's a great return, right? So I think that could be a really interesting fit. There would be more to that trade, right? But giving up Nick Robertson, who I still think has a really high ceiling for Coleman, it's kind of a shift in windows, right? Because the Leafs need a guy who can win right now and make a difference absolutely right now. And Nick Robertson can really help with the Flames in their future. And I think he has a bright future ahead of him, whether it's in Toronto or wherever else. So I think that's an option. I don't know if the Leafs want to do that. I would rather keep on to Nick Robertson, but they're going to have to figure out the salary somehow. Someone's going to have to go the other way or retain salary.
I think that's why it's such an interesting trade, because it makes so much sense for both sides if they can figure out a way to get it done. Because of how young Nick Robertson is in the era that the Flames are entering now following a brutal season last year. And again, the biggest issue, do the Flames want to trade with Brad Treliving? But let us know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on this trade. It's going to be very interesting to see what the Leafs ultimately do, and we'll keep you up to date on that. Thank you guys for watching.